All right, Zwei testing has been completed. I have actually finished upgrading her 10 for 10. So in case you guys are wondering, I've done a pretty fair amount of testing and also just kind of giving it a fair chance to actually compete against everything else in my team. And let's just get right into the numbers, and then I'll explain each part of what the numbers are. These are just kind of like the stats in case you really want to refer to like what the numbers are coming from. One thing I want to note is these numbers are just pretty much like kind of like the average numbers, and it's not a very min-max of like crit fishing or anything like that. So just to prove some points, I'll just tell some teams and then what kind of they mean. So initially we have the Miranda Summer Helm, which is our healer, Snow White, and Yulha team. Just to give an idea, that did like a 2.5 billion damage with my team. The that adjustment that I made with Zwei is I used Tia, Zwei, Summer Helm, Snow White, and Maxwell, and that did 3.5 bill. And really what that ended up being is that double DPS was better. Keep in mind, I did try to make sure that I was following the Yulha timeline on that, so whenever Snow White was bursting, she was getting the Yulha buff there. But really the main difference that you are seeing in here from 2.5 and 3.5 is that the double DPS. And Maxwell ended up getting an extra leg that she was the difference that made that extra 1 bill. This is an improvement to the Snow White team, and this is probably the team that will go moving forward. However, I'll make some adjustments also because, for example, we're not always going to be using Tia. Just to anchor the kind of expectation, I have used D with the bunnies, Blank and Noir, with Redhead and Maxwell, and I did 3.7 billion. But when we start using Zwei against the Iron boss, and all of this was against the Iron Advantage boss, so it's electric boss, and I used Zwei, Summer Helm, Red Hood, Maxwell, and Modernia, and it did 3.8 bill. And so what kind of that just shows, I was saying that like, oh, you can actually kind of use a DPS instead of a support, but it's not the optimal like best team. The second is I started using the Tia, Zwei, Summer Helm, and Red Hood and Maxwell, and that did 4 bill. So that's just like showing you how like actually having a support is good if your Pierce DPS is good, because my Red Hood and Maxwell are relatively good. I have a 31% on attack on Red Hood with 63 elemental. My Maxwell is 30% attack with 23% elemental. My Maxwell had a little bit less of the elemental, however she has a pretty good attack that kind of helps out, especially on this team where Maxwell doesn't really get any additional attack buffers in this team. So because yeah, if you use Tia as Y Summer Home, that leaves Red Hood, her only attack buffer is Maxwell and also her self buff, and then for Maxwell it's just herself plus the additional overloads that she had. That's why like having your Pierce DPS is good. Following that is I tried to replace Maxwell with Ludmilla, and it just turns out that they're not too far off from each other if the boss has core. So that's just to give an idea that like, okay, do you have to always have Maxwell? No. I was using Red Hood in this situation. And I'm talking about Red Hood right now because she does give Pierce, and it does help illustrate some points, which I'll get in a few also. Now the next thing was I switched Summer Helm into Dala, and we take a huge chunk of damage loss. So, and that's just because Summer Helm, which is only really effective for against electric bosses, yeah, we take a huge loss, and as you can see here, that's just gonna put her down even below the typical Blank and Noir combination with D. However, if you have like Summer Helm, then it's actually pretty nice. Another thing that I want to point out is Tia, even though like there's a good synergy between Tia and Zwei, Tia is not really necessary because I actually replaced with Rosanna, and the damage difference is actually not far off when I did Tia Zwei Dala versus Zwei Summer Rosanna Dala. Obviously, the downside here is that you don't have as much defensive capability. However, Zwei herself alone, and I can see it for a lot of top players, well, they will end up like opting into probably just using Zwei if they ever want to use her. And I think one of the most optimal way is to use Zwei alone as the defensive user. This time around, I was using Snow White, Red Hood, and Maxwell, and I was bursting with Snow White and Red Hood here, and I tried testing Zwei with D and Litter, and the damage is actually roughly close to each other in these teams. So on average use case, Zwei, D, and Litter are actually roughly similar, assuming that we did have another source of cooldown reduction, and so that would be Summer Helm in this situation. So in that situation, it actually does come out that Zwei can be up to par of like the pretty much like the two top DPS buffers that we have, which is D and Litter for the Pierce units. One thing I want to note also is that because of I was doing Snow White plus Maxwell and I don't have charge speed on my Snow White, I was actually releasing this at the around between 850 to 950% for the Litter team. And so actually, if you have like some charge speed on your Snow White, which just to give you an idea how much charge would you need, if you're using with with Maxwell, you'd need like an additional 1 line of charge speed. But if you don't have Maxwell, you need at least 2 lines of charge speed. The main thing that Litter and D allows really is that there's stronger burst 2 buffers that we can use, because instead of like using Summer Helm, for example, we can start just using Novel instead, and that will allow Snow White to actually deal way more damage compared to using Zwei and Summer Helm because of that. And we're kind of, like when we use Zwei, we're kind of stuck with using Summer Helm in that situation because, or Dala, because we don't have like a cooldown reduction. And so yeah, because there's no real answer CDR. So yeah, we are doing more damage in virtue for Litter and D, mainly because we have a Litter and D has also a built-in cooldown reduction. The next thing is that Tia, Zwei, Summer Helm, Snow White, and Red Hood. This is just kind of showing that Tia and Zwei is actually better combo than Zwei and Maxwell. And this is assuming that you do have like good attack OLs. And the good thing with Tia and Zwei is it's also a bit more defensive because Tia gives a shield for everybody else. Let's take a step back though. What about the traditional teams? See, there's a huge jump still. So going from like a 4.3 billion damage with the Tia Zwei combo and Summer Helm, well, if we actually use the Crown and D and Naga, this is a boss that has core. It's just a whole nother level, right? Like the Crown and Naga is just a whole nother beast. 30% more damage. Crown, Litter, Red Hood, Snow White, and Naga was even better. And this is just showing again that D is just roughly even with Litter, because actually like for Red Hood, it is like 3.25 versus 3.27. Snow White did get a little bit more on this one, but it could be an off put number of like crit or anything. But yeah, another thing that I want to point out also is because I don't have Maxwell in this, I had to release my Snow White burst between 800 to 900%. So again, if you have charge speed on your Snow White, you would deal way more damage. Now, next example is the Crown plus Litter Red Hood Maxwell Naga. It's just showing that like my Red Hood just did way more damage. It was 3.27 on Red Hood here, and then 3.97 on Red Hood. Now obviously I took a hit because my Snow White was hitting way more on the previous one, but the thing is, the difference here is like there's also a huge gap between my Maxwell and Snow White's overloads. in particular, my Snow White has 45% attack and 71% elemental, versus like my Maxwell, which has 30% attack and 22% elemental. So there's like a huge gap, not only on the attack but also on the elemental, and so that's why it was doing more. So if I had like a more invested Maxwell, that is probably comparatively with Snow White, this would probably do way more, or even maybe close to this team combo. Crown and Glitter plus Red Hood plus Maxwell is the other next example, and this is where I replaced Naga. And Naga and in Crown pretty much just a 1/3 more damage versus boss with core, and because Naga was providing heals and core damage bonus, so we took a huge hit. Like as you can see, Red Hood went from 3.97, or which is almost like 4 bill, and down to 2.8 bill, and then Maxwell from 1.36 billion and down to 1 billion. So that's just to give you a perspective that especially when there's a core on the boss, then Naga is still definitely for sure better. The next example is just another example of Dala in here, where we did use Zwei and Dala, and Red Hood did deal like 2.79, which is like almost like 2.8 bill with like the litter plus Rapunzel with Crown, and this one is Crown, Zwei, Red Hood, Maxwell, Dala. And this is just to give another idea. With the Rapunzel team, comparatively, we're just losing damage because like there's more, it's easier to have the full uptime of Crown's buff, right, versus like Maxwell, just to provide, even though that Dala does give like some attack damage, it's just that the timing sometimes Crown doesn't have the skill to bonus attack damage buff when Maxwell's bursting, so that kind of offsets Maxwell's burst. And then again though, however, if we did put back Summer Helm, we're recouping some of the damage lost for having that extra CDR with Zwei, and Maxwell kind of gets back up again here. It's still not to the same level as like Litter plus Naga against a boss with core, but if the boss doesn't have core, then it would be almost similar to Rapunzel, and it would actually kind of overtake the Rapunzel team in this situation. So if you're using Crown, Litter, Red Hood, Maxwell, Rapunzel, which if the boss doesn't have core, that's what exactly similar to Naga is. And it would actually do more. So the Crown, Zwei, Red Hood, Maxwell, Summer Helm would do more, and that's because of it's doing a damage increase. So to kind of add more to this, I will let the past guy add some more things in here, and then I'll be back to the future Sky after past guy explains a few more things. Like I said, we're like one step away from like greatness. We need a burst to unit cooldown reduction that's like really good. And you know what? I could see a good burst to attack buffers. So here's what I think. We are getting prepped so much with a lot of like these other damage multipliers on burst 1 category. So the burst 1 category, a lot like okay, pierce damage buff on burst 1, true damage with Freema, and technically damage taken debuff on Exia. See, those good buffers like attack damage, Crown is on burst 2, damage taken is on burst 2 category, and that's why they're like really good, right? And Naga core damage bonus, like these are really good units, and they're in burst 2 categories. And so since like the beginning of DK, a lot of the burst 1 category have been attack buffers, but not like true damage buffers, like not the damage category buffers, because again the way kind of things is like, so you have attack buffers, and then there's the damage increase buffers, and these are attack damage, true damage, pierce damage, etc. They have like damage on their on their wording. Typically they're in the same category. So you have the 80 attack buffers, which is the 80k, and then there's the damage increase buffers, and then there's the damage taken increase, which is more debuff, and these are separate. Like these are the three main modifiers. Technically there's like other things like charge damage and stuff. Those are different also, charge damage, critical, etc. But the thing is, like, critical, for example, is diluted with full burst bonus plus range bonus. So there's a reason why critical is like diluted. So you have these all different multipliers, right? Right now, Zwei is sitting in here in the damage increase buffers. And there's not many of these damage increase buffers in the burst 1 category. So there's not a lot of them. And the majority of the burst 1 category buffers are attack buffers, ATK buffers. And so that's why in the burst 2 category, that's also one of the reasons why Crown is like insane, is because she increases this damage category. And then there's also the damage taken increase, which is like for Blanc, and then, oh yeah, I forgot to add this, like core damage is here. The difference, the white Naga is so insanely good with core damage is because she gives insane multipliers on it. Even though it's diluted, it's still insane damage multipliers. So here's the thing, right? Zwei will allow us is to have more open burst too, where we're getting attacked. Now obviously we're lacking a cooldown reduction. See, here's the thing, if a cooldown reduction burst 2 category that increases attack buff releases right now, not talking about Dala, because Dala is actually, she does increase attack, but it's like, it's not a big amount, right? It's 13%, right? So it's not really a big amount compared to, like, say, Litter. Litter has like almost 80%. Actually, it's 80% attack. Like Litter has 80% attack for 5 seconds. So Dala, like 18% right now at level 7s on skill 1 and skill 2. And another thing is skill 1. Timing on this is every 10 seconds. It's not every time she bursts. So like there's possibility that like the skill 1 will be on the tail and buff will happen. So what if you start bursting with Maxwell, right? Like basically there's just a lot of like inconvenience with Dala as a buffer. So that's what it's opening up with. And here's another thing, right? A lot of the major DPS, if you start looking at the major DPS, they have insane attack buff on themselves. When Red Hood bursts, she gets a 71% attack damage on her own. When Scarlet Black Shadow bursts, she gets 115% attack. So what happens is this gets very, very diluted, right? Like you got so much attack buff already. So that's why like it's not as efficient. And so what I could see happening is, so you have Zwei here in the damage increase buffer, and then now you will, if we get a damage taken increase cooldown reduction on the burst 2 category, that would break some things. So like that's where I could see being like super good. But here's the thing, right? There's only one unit right now that does exactly that. The thing about her though is it's only really effective when you're fighting an electric code unit. So really it's more for iron advantage teams. So like right now, her best burst 2 category, even though she's electric, is on an iron team. And so the iron team that we're talking about is specifically this. And then you have like Red Hood Maxwell or like Snow White. And in particular, really it's Snow White, right? Like because of how Snow White and Maxwell works, because of that. So like right now, her best team really is like this, and actually, you know, you could use this, and really, the pierce damage with red did right like this, but it's against iron, or sorry, it's against electric bosses or enemies, which is iron advantage. You don't need a healer because you have shield on Tia, and then you have cover recovery on her. If you start actually like doing mechanics where you actually swap to a particular unit and start covering, that's like, you know, one option. Where is she sitting at right now, right? Like, so basically, even, I mean, you can totally like do this, and this can open up that team building, because again, there's a possibility of us just switching from Tia Naga, and the next team is Crown and Naga, right? Since we're using the Crown and Naga separately now, and it's against like a boss that has core, you're likely gonna put like your strongest team with that. If the boss has core, Crown Naga will be one of the strongest like combinations, and then you just flex it like the particular DPS. And so right now, I see this as very limited team building, because there's not really a lot of pierce damage units. Also, technically you would do this, but then like the question is like, why would you put this, and then now you have Scarlet Black Shadow sitting nowhere. You want Scarlet Black Shadow with Alice right now, like they're pretty much together. I've explained this already. You know, Scarlet Black Shadow gets over like 50% charge speed just with Alice alone, so you can't really like change anything here. So I wouldn't like put Alice in here, basically, is what I'm saying. And there's very little like variations right now. You could definitely do this, right? Like this is one other thing. However, this is strictly speaking just with the current units out right now. So yes, it can open up like the team building, and I think, like, you know, if you want to try to be flexible, this is one of the good times. And here's the good thing about it also: you don't need duplicates, and you only really need one copy, right? Like none of these skills really scale based off like, you know, her buffs. None of them scales based off her how much casters attack there are or whatever. That's a good thing about it. Her damage is pretty much like what a support units are. So if you've seen how much Leona damages, how much Dala damages, she's basically similar in that sense. This is 100% multiplier multiplied by 2 because she's using 2 weapons. But if you actually look at it, this attack multiplier on her weapon for shotguns is similar to, like, say, you know, a support shotgun unit. So if you look at Mary, if you actually see, it's 201.5. And the multiplier on her burst, even though it's multiplied by 2 again, so it's 50.69 multiplied by 2, it's gonna be like 101%. But then you multiply by and then you multiply by the full charge, which is like times 3. It's about like 300%. Get the full damage bonus. What I say though is, I like, don't expect too much damage from her burst. Like that's kind of how I see it. And even then, like, I feel like majority of the people are gonna use her more for support, not for her damage, so they're not really gonna invest a lot. And especially a unit that doesn't necessarily benefit from having any overload, because the main benefit from her overload is max ammo. So like the max ammo here is gonna be like bonus, like cover recovery, right? Like so you're gonna recover more often. But really, other than that, right, like if you're not, a lot of people don't really have that luxury. Right now, the way I see it is, I think, like, if you're not even like trying to build Snow White or Maxwell, it's very difficult to like slot her in right now. She does have the potential of the future, again, like I said, like because of like the different there's not that many different damage increase buffers here. Yeah, they need to release more units. Shift Up have been doing that recently a lot, where they do release the support units before the DPS units that will kind of like benefit from it. We've seen it in shotgun, and technically like with mass, like mass got released before 2B was released, right? So they've been doing a lot more of that recently. So if you think that that would be the case, that's one thing, right? You can use Diesel over Tia as an alternative option. Actually, yes, because you don't have to burst with the helm, technically. But at the same time, also, you don't have to use Tia. You could just like slap in another DPS. All right, so assuming that you probably listened to the past guy like yap for a little bit, or maybe just decided to use the timestamp and look at for the TLDR. Here's the TLDR for you guys. The current main use right now for Zwei is basically Red Hood, Snow White, Maxwell, basically in the Iron / Pierce category DPS. And it's also good for Alice, which gives a constant pierce. Basically, any constant pierce units, Zwei is a relatively good unit. However, it would be bad to use with Alice because typically Scarlet Black Shadow is Alice's best buddy, so they usually don't go hand in hand. And if you did use with Zwei with SBS, that would take a huge damage loss for SBS potential, so that would be kind of like unfortunate. So if you don't have SBS though, then that's actually a good consideration to use Alice then. Now, the optimal ruse for Zwei is basically against Electric Boss, and that's basically with Summer Helm. There's just no doubt about it. That's pretty much like the ideal because of how the multipliers work, of how Zwei is in the attack damage multipliers and Summer Helm is in the damage taken. That's just like the best use. And then any DPS that is Pierce, in particular, the most is obviously the Snow White Maxwell, as a lot of people know, but Red Hood and Alice is actually not bad also. What's really missing for Zwei is basically a burst 2 cooldown reduction that has either a high attack buff or a damage taken increase debuff. Ideally, it would be a damage taken increase debuff because there's not many DPS that increases the damage taken increase other than really primarily Ludmilla, right? So, and majority of the DPS has the attack buff. And if we do have like that burst 2 cooldown reduction that has like a damage taken increase debuff, I would say that Zwei would end up being a higher priority. Now, should you pull, the way I see it is if you do have an invested Snow White and Maxwell, it does open up for a double DPS Snow White Maxwell team 5, and it has a potential good usage and performance for Iron Advantage raid, especially if you have Summer Helm. The other reason for pulling for her is the copium for future units. Shift Up is releasing more supports first rather than before or with the DPS. So kind of like example would be they released Mast and then 2B ended up benefiting really well on Mast, and then they released Tove and Leona, which are the shotgun team, and they ended up benefiting for Maid Privity and Bunny Soda. How many of you could just consider this? How many of you want to build the shotgun team but you don't have Tove? Because you forgone Tove because back then Tove wasn't really that great. So that's just to put it to perspective. Basically, if there's a possible unit in the future that would take advantage of Zwei's pierce damage buff, then that's one team that you might miss out on. Right now, it's not immediately needed. So the way I see it is like, since if you don't really need it now, then you can wishlist it. That's kind of how I see it. But if you don't feel lucky at all, or just like you're strapping for resources, I think that wishlisting is just fine. You can just wait it out, because it's not really needed right now. And it's a team 5. The way I see it is it's more kind of like a team 5 substitute right now. But again, it does have the potential to be team 3, especially for, like, say, the solo raid. Right now for Iron Advantage, it definitely can be a team 3 potential, just because of how we already have a team for it. We have Summerhelm, Snow White, and Maxwell. But for other elements, probably not yet. It's funny that she is an electric unit. However, the ideal elemental where she is gonna be used on is against Iron Advantage bosses, right? For dupes, you don't really need dupes because of how there's nothing really that's necessary for her scaling skill, and she doesn't really need a lot of DPS. Then dupes, you don't really need that. And then build, I would probably go with 747, and then 10-4-10 is probably the max for her. Really, the 10-7-10, I only see it being done by top players playing around with the cover. Even then, most top players will have whale advantage, like, you know, the dolls and core duplicates. So do they really need the 7-10? Maybe not, but yeah. Anyways, overload, you don't really need to overload because her damage isn't really anything to take home off. However, if you do decide to overload, I think ammo is a good to support her skill 2 for the cover recovery. The cube is either resilience or bastion so that she can shoot more often. For dolls, I wouldn't really put dolls right now for her. And then the pros and cons, assuming that we have another source of cooldown reduction, she ends up feeling like a side grade in terms of overall damage increase compared to the top 2 burst 1 buffers right now, which is Litter and D for the Pierce units, so like Red Hood and others. And it can be a better upgrade with the one-shot burst, which is like Snow White or Maxwell, where they charge up during their burst. Note that also this is probably with the idea of crit fishing, and it depends on the team, whichever the boss is. Basically, it can be, so it's more as a potential, and it will focus still on crit fishing. Just in general though, any typical one-shot bursters are more focused on the crit fishing. Otherwise, if you don't focus on crit fishing, you don't like that crit fishing, again, it would feel more like a side grade if you say like you were using Litter before. It's a good Pierce buffer, and for units with high self-attack buffs, Red Hood, Alice, and pending feature units, this unit is a good buffer. And the most ideal also is if they're burst shot units, so like Snow White or Maxwell, and again, future pending units that we don't know. It's both good offensive unit and defensive unit because of the Pierce buff, and then the defensive unit is the cover recovery. There's less reliance on crit compared to the previous Snow White team, which is like the Yulha team, and then it does open up for a multiple DPS build / team compared to the previous Snow White team, again, because previously the Snow White team, Snow White was carrying that huge back on her own, and depending on the boss, you know, if there's more opportunities for Pierce every burst situation, then this team would perform better. Or maybe there's not a lot of opportunity for multi-shot Pierce, then this team would perform better than the typical Snow White team with Yulha. Cons is pretty much without any cooldown reduction, being on her own as burst 1, it does restrict the team building, which basically the way I see it is she does kind of end up being more really as a team 5 for majority of the situations. And then in the teams, which really just Iron team right now, she can be a higher priority because of Summerhelm. Another downside is she's not really a general buffer, so only units can benefit off her right now. Technically, there's other Pierce units like LaPlus and everyone else, but they're not really great for I would say with Zwei, and I think the 4 DPS units right now that are out are the most that would benefit off her. Final thing about that bad about her is that she's not very beginner friendly, and that is because the ideal gameplay is to not shoot or not bring any other healer and defensive units, and basically take advantage of her cover no healer gameplay. I think that's to make the best use out of her. And then another is the Snow White team pierce shooting, where you're gonna have to more focus on getting those multi hits. It's definitely not good for mobile. For a lot of people, you're gonna have trouble with this. And then the optimal play is crit fishing. Even though that it is less reliance to crit, any team that really relies on the one-shot burst, their optimal play is still crit fishing. And the reason for that is because it's easier to see the moment you burst. You can see if it crit or not. And then a lot of the top players would actually spend hours, just 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, just on a single team, just to min max, just so that every single shot gets a critical. That's just the way it is. That's just how one-shot burst teams are, regardless of what you do. I'm not saying that she's not good for other Pierce units, right? Like I mentioned, Red Hood, Alice, still good. It's just not as optimal as, say, where she is meant to be used, or her ideal use unit. So you can use her as a general Pierce buffer for any Pierce DPS units, and she just shines the most with the one-shot burst. But yeah, that is my Zwei kind of guide talking about it. Really, if anything else, I think my general idea for this, I would save for a lot of people that would want her anyways, or that have an idea or has some sort of desire to use like those Snow White team, like a very high technical, high skill ceiling team. That is, they can start coping on that, and you can start pulling for Zwei. But otherwise, like, I think there's Collab coming in. You know, we always say this, really. Back then, before the summer, oh, there's summer coming in. Oh, there's Collab coming in. Start saving. But yeah, it's just because this unit is just not a universal, oh, you must pull. And so that's why and also she is wish listable. So that's why it's just better to just like save for a lot of people. And again, any people that this wants to kind of like take advantage of her already probably have pulled already before even like watching this video. But yeah, what do you guys think? Did you guys like pull for her? Do you guys like her design? Did you how many pulls, if you did pull, did you get her? How many pulls? I don't remember how much pulls I did, but yeah, the good thing about this is we just need one copy, right? But anyways, that's my Zwei Thoughts guide, whatever you call this. If you guys have any questions, as usual, twitch.tv/KaiJLV. That's where we hang out a lot more often. And I'll see you guys next time.